So I'm going to talk about autism and sexuality. I brought notes because this is a special interest of mine, so I might talk too much. So I have notes, and I'll try and stay on schedule. I promise. I was lovely introduced. My name is Emily Coombs. I identify with she/they pronouns, and I included the only picture of myself attending Pride, and I'm going to talk about that later on. But I need people to know that I've been once, okay? Because it's an experience. I study intersectionality of autism and sexuality and gender experiences, as well as I dabble with my supervisor, Heather Brown, in experiences of higher education and interpersonal relationships. I would like to hit on 3 key areas today. So firstly, I want to talk about what sexuality is, like the definition of what sexuality is, and operationally define what LGBT plus. I'm removing that T and I'll tell you why. I also want to let you know what the research is saying as well and highlight some of the works that I am doing because it is a special interest of mine and I do want to talk about my research. And I want to leave you with how to be a good ally so that you can support the sexually diverse autistic peers, colleagues, and friends, as well as partners in your life. You will notice that I left out the T, and I made that very, very explicit. I do want to specifically focus this presentation on sexuality. T, gender diversity, transgender, is a really, really, really big topic, and it deserves its own presentation, just like sexuality deserves its own presentation. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about that afterwards, as well as push that we should be focusing on gender diversity as its own topic area. So I will get right into it. The first, I want to help you answer 2 questions. Who experiences sexuality and what sexual identities are there? Let's start with what is sexuality? Sexuality encompasses sexual feelings, attraction, behavior, and identity. At one point or another, some of us have felt sexual feelings, desire, pleasure, or affection towards someone else. This usually is coupled with an attraction either to aesthetics or to their personality or behaviors, which includes flirtation, kissing, eventually maybe some intercourse. These forms of physical interactions are behaviors and are more neurocognitive, and we also experience more neurocognitive experiences such as an increase of dopamine released during shared activities with someone we're attracted to. Identity-based labels are really, really important to defining what of the sexuality. And that's where we get that it is integral to human life. Sexuality influences emotional and social well-being more than anything else. This is why we see that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer individuals experience a high amount of adverse mental health experiences. And that's not to make it all doom and gloom. There is real institutions as to why this happens. For instance, the assumption is that it's just assumed straight. Every child is assumed straight, and that institution, especially in a Western culture, has real-world impacts on people trying to come out and trying to live their most authentic life. Additionally, it has deep culturally informed context as well. This assumed straight narrative has not always been this way, and especially in a Western sense. For instance, in ancient Roman culture, and I'm saying that broadly because ancient Rome expanded thousands of years, we saw homosexual behavior as a normalcy. We saw queer expressions as part of what was expected of young men. That being said, there's a lot that has changed in a more socially conservative Western society. So that brings me to the who of sexuality. So everyone experiences sexuality. That includes people who are defined as asexual. And I'm just going to quickly define what asexual means. So asexual is those who identify with not experiencing some form of the what of sexuality. So they might not experience having sexual behaviors or sexual attraction or even romantic attraction, or they might experience one part of that. However, that is still a sexuality. Being void of sexuality still means you have sexuality. As well as sexuality is a natural part of human life, and it evolves over the course of the lifetime. And I'm briefly going to talk about that as well. But I want to highlight what LGBT plus stands for. So the L stands for lesbian, the B stands for gay, and the G stands for gay, and the P stands for bisexual. So lesbian operationally is defined as women, or those perceived as women, being sexually or romantically attracted to other women, period. And then gay is the male reverse of that, while bisexual is the binary, I am attracted to both male, female. And I put that kind of emphasis on very binary language is because historically these definitions have existed in binary systems where it was just men who are attracted to just men, just women who are attracted to just women. We are now seeing a more expansive approach and a less binary approach to defining. And I'm not saying we are now as like it just developed and we're just getting here. We are now reclaiming a non-binary understanding of what defines each definition of the LGBT plus. And that is bringing a lot more self-definition. For instance, someone who defines themselves as bisexual will define them by their bisexuality very, very different than if you were to interview another bisexual on the street. And that's okay. And even labels such as gay are being defined personally, and we have to leave room for self-definition. Additionally, I just want to highlight, you probably have heard about there's 10% of the world's population is LGBTQ+. And that's kind of right. If we look globally, it's about 7.1%, and it changes geographically just depending on where you are in the world. And that has a lot to do with safety. For instance, if you are LGBTQ+ in Russia, you're likely not going to answer a survey saying, I identify as LGBTQ+, or you're not even going to ponder that feeling that you might have come up, or even explore that for yourself. Where if you're in Canada, where it's a little bit more socially progressive, you're going to feel more inclined to see where that might lead you, whether or not that's a sexually divergent label that you want to take. So I just want to touch on quickly on the when. So sexuality develops over the course of the lifetime. In early childhood and even infancy, we see infants and toddlers exploring their bodies and sensations. There is such things as self-masturbation in infancy, and it's seen as a self-soothing behavior. In pre-adolescence, this is where we really see the curiosity about bodies, where children start to get an inclination that my body might be different than your body, and that's okay. This really amps up in adolescence, where there is a difference between that body is different than my body, and we are assigning gender labels to it. And there's this hardwired, really excited part of our experience called puberty, where we start to have deep attractions and sexual attractions, and we start to develop who we are attracted to, what we're attracted to, and a kind of a sense of self. And that's where we see people starting to get that identity label for us. And then lastly, this is where in adulthood, where we still see ever shifting labels. Someone might have a sense of who they are in adolescence, might even identify as straight, for instance, get into adulthood, go to a different part of the world, go to a different city, and be like, oh, I think I might be changing my identity, and that's okay. And the fact that sexuality is not stagnant and shifts over the course of a lifetime is something to be celebrated. I want to highlight, sexuality does not disappear when you are an elder. You will have sexual experiences and sexual inclinations as you age. So, autism and sexuality. There has been a pervasive, chronic understanding and assumption that autistic people are asexual, or that they have the emotional range of an infant. that they can never develop past this asexuality, or even that sexuality cannot be assumed to be a part of their experience. And this has existed at the foundation of the autism diagnosis for a very, very long time, and it continues to exist. It has not disappeared, but it has shifted and changed. We also saw in the early 2000s a shift towards re-education with sexual education. There was a big problem that was identified in the early 2000s that autistic individuals were experiencing a really high degree of sexual assault. And because of this, people were like, we need to do something. And this spurred a lot of studies towards sexual education. This one study that I'm highlighting on the screen was the first to be like, oh yeah, and autistic people experience sexuality, and people were scathed. And this study spurred a lot more understanding. So in the 2010s, we found that we finally put our foot down and said, yes, autistic people do experience sexuality. They have positive sexual functioning, because again, it was assumed that autistic people were asexual or couldn't even participate in sexuality at all, which is wrong. And now we're seeing a lot more tailored sexual education and support. So I did promise that I would focus on LGBTQ+, and I'm gonna make my case for why I need to focus on this. And it's because we are starting to see really massive trends of autistic individuals identifying as LGBTQ+. And I love this study, this George and Stokes study. This study found of its autistic respondents, 69.7% of them identified as LGBTQ+. That is a massive majority, completely massive majority. When we reflect back at the earlier part of the presentation where I said 7% of the world globally identifies as LGBTQ+, and we look at this, just this one stat in the study, we're like, oh, wow, that's a big group. Another study, and I want to say the George and Stokes study was US-based. Another study in Germany also found that largely their participants identified as LGBTQ+. 10% of their section of their group identified as bisexual, 7 as homosexual, and they had very binary labels. So this is why we see this 14% being like, your labels don't accurately capture what I define my sexuality as. So there is this proclivity to identify with more self-defined labels. And lastly, we are seeing, and I want to put emphasis on this, because I'm so glad that Emily spoke before me, the other Emily, that we're seeing those identified female at birth, women, trans feminine individuals, non-binary individuals who were identified female at birth, they have higher rates of identifying as LGBTQ+. So this subgroup, as earlier mentioned, who is underdiagnosed, who is this 4-to-1 ratio or this 2-to-1 ratio, is largely more autistic, largely more LGBTQ+ than their male counterparts. And that is an extreme case of note, essentially. We have to see that group as very important for conscious study, and it's largely understudied, which has led me to my research. So I just want to highlight one study from my master's thesis. I had an overwhelming amount of interest in my study, but I narrowed it down to 17 participants. And they were all identified as autistic. They self-identified as either women, so transgender or cisgender, or as femme, so somewhere on the non-binary feminine spectrum. And they all identified as diverse sexually as well. We conducted semi-structured interviews, and I did a reflexive thematic analysis. And I did have many themes with sub-themes, but I just want to highlight 3 important ones. And is that their experiences of gender, and I know I promised I wouldn't talk about it too much, but it's really important to highlight, but their experiences of gender and sexuality were very disconnected from a rigid binary sense of what what we generally as a populace are sold we're supposed to identify with. Secondly, they skillfully navigated their intersectional identities in order to find community and connection. So they would seek out other queer autistic people in order to build up their sense of self. And lastly, knowing their identities, having that label, self-defining it for them was really, really, really protective on systems of oppression. So I'm going to wrap it up really quick because I want to leave room for questions. And I know we're all really hungry for lunch. But I want to make this work and everything I just kind of talked at you really actionable in our own lives. So that starts with being an ally. So ally is active, consistent, arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person in a position of privilege, and a position of privilege is actually being straight, because straightness is an assumed identity of everyone, at least in this Western cultural context. And it's seeking to readjust that power imbalance in order to uplift and empower the non-straight autistic individuals in your life. However, allyship is not self-defined. You don't get to decide if you're an ally. The people who are in positions of marginalization, so queer autistic individuals, they get to decide. So I often I make a joke. You can either be a lowercase a ally or an uppercase a ally. And what really sets people apart in being just an ally or an uppercase a ally is like their humility. When you don't impose your allyship on marginalized individuals, and you become this kind of constant, conscious individual who takes allyship as just a social expectation rather than a role you have to achieve to be a good person, then you are a capital A ally. And lastly, allyship is not an identity. You should not be putting in your bio that you are an ally. That's not some label you get to carry around in your life and that you get to attend Pride because there's a letter in the LGBTQ plus label for you. You are an ally and you can attend Pride and you can support others because it is the good thing to do. It is what we should expect of our fellow humans. So how to put that in practice? Always center the impacted. When you might have the most great ideas about how to be an ally, how to help this autistic queer person out at your workplace, and you might be trying to make a support group and get them in front of people who matter. But if they don't want that, then that's not going to help them. It's about being present in what their needs are rather than what you think their needs are. And that goes to the next point. You have to listen, and listen with an open heart. And I that's a really funny thing to say because our hearts are inside our bodies, but it's the intention about what that means. It's about being present and not bringing yourself into that space in order to make room for a person who has had multiple groups of their identities be marginalized. The other L is leverage your privilege. As a straight non-autistic, or even as a straight autistic person, you have privilege in navigating different systems. Additionally, if you add on that white label, you have all the privilege, and you can metamorph into whoever you need to be in order to be this backbone for a marginalized community. In my work outside of academia, we call it coyoteing, and that's being this kind of sneaky individual who gets the work done because you're unassuming. Whiteness, non-autisticness, and straightness is an unassuming trait because that is at the foundation of what Western society is built on. And lastly, yield the floor. And I really appreciate being invited today. It honestly meets this why. It's making a space so that the voices of queer autistic individuals are heard, are advocated for, and are platformed. So